Universities are meant to pursue truth, not necessarily your truth. Instead, they've become factories for ideological conformity, where entire disciplines are effectively no-go zones for certain questions. Questions about race, gender, equity, etc. And so much research has to pass through this filter of progressivism or woke social justice. But not every academic is woke. Just recently, a bunch of academics and journalists and writers have been pushing back. The Buckingham Manifesto is a prime example of this, designed to restore free inquiry to higher education. And my guest today is at the center of the Buckingham Manifesto, Eric Kaufmann. It's a statement of principles and a plan of action aimed at reintroducing intellectual diversity into academia, defending heterodox social science, and possibly building a space for critical study of today's dominant ideology, woke. So surely the effort isn't going to be for the faint-hearted, but it might be exactly what universities need. I'm Melanie Bennett. This is Disrupted. Professor Eric Kaufmann, welcome to the show.
Melanie, it's great to be here.
I have noticed multiple efforts going on recently within academia, but also involving journalists, writers, many people interested in what's going on at universities. And you are part of that. You have released, I suppose you could say, this Buckingham Manifesto. I was hoping that you could describe what that is. Oh, but before you do that, I have one pressing question.
Okay.
Is woke, in fact, dead?
Woke is not dead, despite Andrew Doyle's new book title, The End of Woke. It is, however, at an inflection point where it's no longer rising. And I think that's important because there are some measures that show it falling and some other measures that show it retaining support on some measures. So at best it's holding and, well, sorry, let me rephrase that. It may be holding ground or it may be declining. It partly depends on what we're looking at. My view is we're at an interesting point where the aura of inevitability that this was the path of history and that you better be on this train or you're going to be left behind. I think that kind of whole aura has been shattered. But there's a lot of zombies out there that are continuing to just march on, right? So it is an interesting point. And this is something I want to return to. I will talk a bit more about why I think these things. But I just wanted, I don't know if you want to say something, or I wanted to say something about the Buckingham Manifesto.
Yes, absolutely.
Which fits into this. So really what happened is I got some money to organize a conference at the University of Buckingham, where I'm based, which is kind of the only free speech ethos university in Britain, even though a lot of the staff and students are not necessarily that way inclined. But its tradition and founding by Margaret Thatcher is in that direction. So we have this conference, and we managed to bring in a lot of big names from the U.S. in particular. We had about almost 45 speakers. And it really spanned quite a broad range within the tent of people who think there's a problem within academia. So what this conference was really about were two things. One is about heterodox social science. In other words, we're going to do social science across the red lines set by progressive orthodoxy. So an example might be, progressive orthodoxy might be, well, racial inequality, any disparity that's between, say, black and white can only be explained by discrimination. And if we can't find it in individual level attitudes, it must be, quote unquote, systemic. So systemic racism is the only way of explaining any sort of discrepancy in incarceration or admittance to Harvard or wealth or whatever. So That's an example of heterodox social science. It would be to say, well, actually, family structure might be really important if we want to explain the racial wealth gap. And so we have to take that into account and take into account average age and a whole bunch of other factors, primary school education. So that is just a way of saying that there are all these questions that social science academics are not really allowed to investigate. There was a sociologist who tried to say, well, actually, we don't find evidence of discrimination against Asians in the labor market. He couldn't publish that paper, and he would get nasty stares and cold shoulders at conferences. And I mean, for saying something that's really not particularly explosive. But that's sort of an example of the way in which progressivism narrows the scope of inquiry, makes us dumber in a way. It shuts down lines of inquiry. So we're trying to say, well, we want to ski in the off-piste areas, and we want to actually correct and rebalance knowledge in the social sciences. That's kind of mission one. Kind of related to that, mission two is what I call critical woke studies, which is to say there's this really important ideology. We can call it social justice, we can call it the cultural left, that's been going since the new left of the late 1960s. And it needs to be studied like any other ideology, like nationalism or fascism or communism or liberalism, regardless of whether you like the ideology or not. Normally, these things spawn conferences, and they spawn textbooks and courses and graduate programs. Well, none of that's happening because this is just seen as being a nice person, and everyone must believe in this. And so those are kind of the twin aims: critical woke studies, heterodox social science, and those are also the twin aims of the Buckingham Manifesto.
Correct me if this is incorrect, but you do actually teach a course on woke. I mean, it might not be called critical woke studies, or maybe it is, but so there is something. And if you're teaching that, are you aware of any other courses that are similar to that?
Well, exactly. So I'm teaching this standalone online course on woke, 15 weeks, which is open to anybody at low cost, but there aren't any others. I mean, the only place where there's anything reasonably similar is Andrew Doyle's got a new half-year course, I think, at University of Austin, another kind of dissident university. It's perhaps more from a literary and humanities and history of ideas perspective, which is part of what I do, but I do a lot also on the social transmission and political impact of this. But yeah, it's pretty much, other than that, is pretty much lacking entirely. And yet, if we look at the major newspapers, we look at sort of social justice concepts, mention of woke, it's just exploded since the mid-2010s. And there's crickets in university. And so that is remarkable.
Yeah.
So,
Let's look at the Canadian element to this, because for the Buckingham Manifesto, I noticed that there are a couple of Canadian signatories. There's Jordan Peterson and Gad Saad. And if there's more, maybe you could let me know. But there's, and yourself, although maybe you could be considered both British and Canadian as well. But it doesn't seem to be an awful lot of support coming from Canada. And in a related Telegraph article that you wrote recently, I'm just going to quote a statistic that you brought up, that a Macdonald-Laurier Institute report found that 9% of academics back right-wing parties in Canada compared to 40% of the population. And so I guess it's really a question of, what's the situation here in Canada? Are you feeling that there are many more academics that are on board with this and potentially not signing up for any particular reason? Or just generally, what's your feeling about the situation for Canada?
Yeah, really, really good question. I mean, the first thing to note is, the Buckingham Manifesto, we might have just over 30 signatories, and maybe it's something similar for the Manhattan Statement. We're really talking about a very tiny number of the total number of academics, which could be as high as 1 million in the US and 100,000 in Britain, in terms of people teaching in some capacity in the higher ed sector. So I wouldn't take that as indicative of Canada versus the US or Britain. Very few British signatories on either one. I think in Canada there's a pretty vibrant heterodox academic community or communities, and there are plenty of people. Society for Academic Freedom, SAFS, is one organization in Canada that has an annual conference. You've got the Heterodox Academy chapters now at many places. Simon Fraser University would be one example. UBC would be another one. So there are plenty of these chapters. There are plenty of academics, and I've given some talks in Ontario, and so there is a very active dissident community in Canada. Now, what are the differences? So one of the big questions is really how do we position Canada vis-a-vis the U.S. and Britain when it comes to, first of all, woke policies, universities. I think that's interesting. The proportion of Canadian academics who are on the left, the studies that I've seen would suggest that it's pretty much in line with the US and Britain. There's not much difference in the three countries. It's overwhelmingly on the left. Probably the ratio is, let's say, roughly 10 on the left for every one on the right. Now, if we get into top universities, top research universities in the social sciences and humanities, that's probably moving up into like the 15-to-1 territory. Conservatives are in and around 5% of the total, maybe nudging towards 10% in Britain. It's very small. Far left is a significant 25% to a third of the staff in the social sciences in all countries. I don't think the academics in Canada are further left than they are anywhere else. They're not to the right, but they're not different. That's not the difference. The difference is also not in the publics. In my Macdonald-Laurier Institute survey of the Canadian public, I did the same survey in Britain and in the US, and I basically found that essentially in all three countries, the public is about 2-to-1 against the woke position. A good question might be, is Canada a racist country? For those who have an answer in Canada, 70% no, 30% yes. In the U.S. and Britain, the share who say their country is racist is higher than 30 on that question. So Canada is actually less woke on that question. In this survey, there's going to be a certain amount of noise. Perhaps on some other questions, it may be the other way around. But basically, the public isn't woke. The academics are similar. What is the difference? The difference is not necessarily in that opinion segment. It is very much in the power of what we might call politically correct norms or woke public culture in Canada, which is stronger, and it extends to the right of the political spectrum more, which used to be the case in the U.S. It used to be the case in the Republican Party that you didn't want to really talk about immigration, you didn't really want to talk about affirmative action too much. That was seen as something that you shouldn't do by the Republican National Committee, the establishment. That's all shifted since the Tea Party, since Trump. And those taboos have come down on the right side of the spectrum. I think that's much less true in Canada, and also in Britain, it's perhaps a little in between. But in Canada, if you look at Polya, for example, he was for a long time very reluctant to get involved in the gender debate, in the immigration debate, in critical race theory debate. You see that with Doug Ford. You saw that with Danielle Smith in Alberta as well, by the way, who was all in on the trans stuff. So I think that was, and it is changed a little bit to some degree. It's just starting. And really, I'd say Blaine Higgs in New Brunswick really has to be seen as the pioneer, the first one to say, actually, I'm going to stick my neck out. And that's led to some imitating, but it hasn't led yet to a situation where you've got a rapid shift.
Yeah, well, even some of my reporting where Nova Scotia Progressive Conservative in Houston, Premier Houston approved, or his cabinet approved trans bottom surgeries for minors. And so that's certainly another example of I guess, the right being more woke. But the real question for me that I'd like to know is, how do we deal with it in Canada? Because it seems to me that the woke is embedded within so many of our provincial and federal policies demanding that these things take place. And Lindsay Shepherd, came up with some suggestions on how to deal with them. And I'd be curious to see your feeling on whether or not Canada can actually do these things. She listed in MLI that enforcing free speech laws, public funding reforms, alternative and parallel institutions, intra-university centers, strategic takeovers of institutions like New College, Florida, for example, by Ron DeSantis. Are these things even possible in Canada?
I think these are all good ideas, and I think they are possible with the political will. And, one of the questions is, I know there's some loose talk about University of Lethbridge possibly having the first such center for civic thought, which would be a kind of non-progressive center. Now, one of the questions I would have is whether everything I hear is that, in fact, the Alberta cabinet some of it is squishy, and so it is a very far cry from MAGA, from even, some of the populist conservatism you see in parts of the British electoral landscape now with reform. There doesn't seem to be that yet. We're not yet at that point. Now, what seems to be occurring is that the grassroots in the provincial conservative parties, whether it be in Ontario, whether it be in Alberta, Saskatchewan, are in touch with what's going on the internet in the United States and perhaps in Europe. It's really going to be up to them at convention time to be pressuring their leaders and calling their leaders to account. I think this is where, if there is any pressure, I think it's coming from that quarter. And from the National Post and some of the right of center press, which is smaller, not as powerful in Canada as it would be in Britain, for example. So can't put as much pressure on the politicians. But that's really where it has to start. And then once the politicians are feeling the heat, if they're being sort of squishy on these issues and trying to avoid cultural issues because they don't want to be accused of being a transphobe or a racist or something. So it takes populist pressure or grassroots pressure in order to force careerist politicians to stop playing it safe. And once they stop playing it safe, if they decide they're going to be populist, that opens the door then to say anything becomes possible. You can then say, yeah, we're going to have centers that are funded from the government. We are going to have free speech laws, not like Ontario and Alberta, the free, you have to have a set of principles. That's not enough. You actually have to have, like they have now in Britain with the Office for Students' Academic Freedom Directorate, which comes out of the legislation, which I was involved in to some degree. And what that means is you have to have real-time monitoring and enforcement and penalties in terms of fines. Universities have to promote. They don't have to just, defensively protect free speech. And all of that, we'll see if it's going to be interesting because what date are we now? We are the 29th of July. On the 1st of August, the provisions of the Academic Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act come into force in Britain. And we're going to see activity by pressure groups. If universities think they can just do business as usual, those pressure groups are going to be exposing them, registering these complaints with the directorate. So you need to have something that is proactive, not just reactive. And so if Alberta was serious, they would push all this stuff, and they could push all this stuff on their universities. Now, it may be that something I don't know if it's the charter, but maybe there are some legal frameworks around equality law that may need to be changed. I actually don't know if you even need to change the laws. I think you could probably get away with issuing guidelines as to how to interpret the law. It's this kind of legalese, but you have to have trained lawyers who can, when the civil servants say, oh, we can't do that because of Direction 425, you have to have some lawyers who say, no, actually, that's not in force here, or the threshold is wrong. Someone who can just answer back quickly to those civil servants who are generally, not always, but will tend to be cautious or sympathetic to the progressive agenda. So you need to be able to overcome civil servants' resistance and push through this. And you're seeing that in the U.S., in the red states, and also federally.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if people within the bureaucracies or within the professions might also rise up with a populist move. I mean, that's always a possibility. But one area that we haven't discussed is the media.
Yeah.
The media definitely ignore a lot of, I guess, counter woke issues in Canada, and that's something that I'm familiar with. And I found it curious recently. I'm going to quote you again. You said in Substack, is one thing that for podcasters or content creators to say that the establishment has been wrong, but without academic bona fides rooted in scholarship based on having read the literature and used rigorous methods, progressive policymakers and journalists can readily dismiss their critics as simple and uninformed. I agree with this because it seems to me that it wouldn't matter how well crafted an argument that I would make for some of the dangers of these things going on and other people as well. That's so easily dismissed. Just recently, I published an article about the Canadian Nurses Association Code of Ethics, which I can only describe as gone full woke,
Right.
now deciding that nurses must apply a planetary health lens to the clinical care, taking into account the interconnectedness of living and non-living entities in things like perhaps your next blood test appointment. And I say this without exaggeration. It comes with a whole policy statement, and there's a lot going on in this so-called planetary health lens in nursing. And I noticed that some of the pushback from this article from, I guess, the left or activists on the left was throwing all of these studies that these nurses or the groups of nurses, the activist nurses were using for this. So these rely on things like disparity studies, which have maybe questionable statistics within them. But also, a lot of this is done on qualitative data, right? So we know, so there isn't much that is countering in the literature. It's just overwhelmed, and we know there's a replication crisis at university. And I'm just wondering, do you see that making a big difference? Because that's quite a mountain to face, being able to not only publish the information, but then people then taking it seriously.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of key issues you identify. I mean, one is that the cultural left has been very adept at inhabiting, taking over institutions, using credentials as a shield for bad arguments. Now, of course, there have been a number of hoax papers like James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose and Peter Boghossian's that have shown how easy it is to unmask the pretensions to expertise and knowledge of some of these radical, particularly these softer social sciences. It essentially doesn't rest on any hard objective data or anything rigorous. It's just that they're citing each other. They're saying, look, I've cited 50 people. Of course, they're all people who have the same ideological bent and who are not rooted in anything real. So it has this appearance of knowledge. And that's why it's so easy to unmask in a hoax paper, of which there have been a number where people just say, well, as long as you just essentially tip your hat to the right ideological registers, you'll get published and you'll become another paper that can be cited by somebody else. So yeah, this citation mafia, I mean, it's a matter of really sort of pulling at the strings and unwinding it. But there is a degree to which the average member of the public, and particularly, people like judges, they will accept at face value someone who has a PhD and is an academic. They'll just think, oh, they must be the expert. I've given a number of witness statements in a number of court cases, and the point I always have to make is we're dealing with the sort of furthest left part of the public opinion spectrum here, people who reject objective truth and the scientific method. You cannot think of these people as experts, like people who know how to build a bridge or do cardiac surgery. And so, but of course, they kind of launder their ideology through the PhD, through the institution, and make it seem as though, no, they're just dispassionate experts, but actually they're ideologues, but they've laundered that and they through the credential, and so they appear as kind of neutral. And that's one of the big problems, is convincing a lot of ordinary people who really give a lot of credence to people who come along with a credential and think, oh, they must know something. The problem is, what I would say is, okay, well, given that that's the case to some degree, I mean, obviously we have to try and unmask those pretensions. I think it's really important for people like you to do what you're doing to get the message out and say it in concrete, normal language that people understand. So you are contributing to knowledge. I don't think, however, it is also worth building up dissident academia so that we have also the credentialed dissenters that can say, no, these people are just talking nonsense. One of the things that, coming out of the Buckingham Manifesto are a number of follow-on activities. I mean, one of which is going to be an edited book on post-progressivism in the social sciences, which I'm going to be putting forward. But another is we're trying to set up a digital hub for countercultural dissenting social science with an AI that will allow you to query. We're kind of collect a repository of countervailing social science, which people then can come along and query. Someone like yourself could do a query, and it would search the literature and give you an answer, and you would have the references and the citations. The point there being, we need to rebalance knowledge. Now, you might say it's a huge hill to climb, and it is when you've got 20 of their side for every one on the other side. But what I'd say is this, is that the vast majority of academic papers are never cited and never read. They may contribute almost nothing to the sum total of human knowledge. And so we don't have to replicate everything that's being done. We just have to have a small number of very effective papers that get a lot of amplification. So at the level of knowledge production and influence, we need to be equal. We don't have to be equal in terms of numbers. What that means is we need to work in a more coordinated, smarter way where we can get all the work that's done on the dissenting side needs to be amplified and read at a much higher rate than the work that's done on the progressive side. And so that's really the challenge, is to say, well, can we devise this system where what is at present only a small number of, dissenting voices can really start to change the conversation at the policy level, government level. So that's kind of one of the goals of this movement for countercultural social science, of which I'm quite heartened by. The response to the conference, the energy was amazing. And now with the manifesto, we've got pretty good pickup. I think we're going to continue. We're, video from the conference. We're going to have grants and publications. And so, yeah, I'm hoping that this can be the start of trying to turn it around at the high cultural level, because we've got effective people now, podcasts like yours, some media where I'd say in the media space and the podcast space, particularly new media and online, it's more balanced. The problem is really in the institutions. How do we kind of balance out those institutions?
Well, that's exciting. Quality over quantity for sure. On the progressive left, there's a lot of quantity. A lot of it is questionable. So that would be exciting to see what's coming up next on that. Well, listen, we're out of time, and I appreciate very much that you appeared on my show, and good luck.
Thanks, Melanie, and keep up the great work. Canada needs you.
Thank you. All right, take care. That's all for today. The culturally left bias in universities isn't going to disappear anytime soon. And efforts like the Buckingham Manifesto show that there's a serious pushback starting to take shape. Whether it gains ground will depend on whether people inside and outside academia, possibly even brave politicians, might be willing to support open inquiry. I just want to thank Professor Kaufmann for joining me today, and thank you for listening. If you found this conversation helpful or useful, maybe consider liking and subscribing and sharing it amongst friends. I'm Melanie Bennett. This is Disrupted.